You're listening to KCRW. I'm Matt Guilhem. Well, at the Glasgow Climate Change Conference earlier this month, LA Mayor Eric Garcetti touted the idea of a global Green New Deal. But the local version of the initiative he proposed in 2019 for the city still has a ways to go. A major sticking point, decarbonization. Some worry converting the city's aging housing stock to zero emissions could have a painful side effect, forcing thousands of tenants out of their homes. Joining us to talk about it is Chelsea Kirk, a research and policy analyst at Strategic Actions for a Just Economy. Welcome, Chelsea.
Hi, Matt. Thank you.
So decarbonization may be a fairly new term for a lot of people. What exactly does decarbonization mean? And if you can briefly, where does it fit into the LA Green New Deal?
Yeah, sure. So decarbonization means to reduce a building's carbon footprint, which is done by replacing polluting natural gas appliances with all electric appliances, and by reducing a building's energy consumption through energy efficiency measures. Some examples of this include upgrading lighting to LED bulbs, replacing wall insulation, weatherproofing, and things like that. Specifically, the goal is to decarbonize all new buildings by 2030 and all buildings by 2050, both residential and commercial buildings, recognizing that the building stock is actually the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the city. It accounts for 41% of the city's emissions. Compare that to transportation, which represents only like 21% of emissions.
Now, curtailing greenhouse gas emissions from LA buildings, it sounds like a good thing, but you say that for the people living in those buildings, it could be a rough process. In a nutshell, what happens to tenants?
Yeah, so we have to understand the cost of decarbonization to really understand how it impacts tenants. So decarbonization is costly. On average, for existing buildings, that's around $21,000 per housing unit. And that cost under existing laws can be fully passed on to tenants in LA, whether they're rent controlled or not.
We'll talk a little bit about that. There are no protections for people living in rent stabilized buildings?
Correct. So for rent controlled tenants who are protected by the local rent stabilization ordinance, a special cost recovery program exists that allows landlords to increase rents beyond the annual allowable rent increase for retrofit work. And it allows landlords to pass 100% of the cost down in the form of a permanent rent increase of up to 10%. Then there are tenants protected by the state's Tenant Protection Act, who not only can receive a rent increase already of up to 10%, but can actually be evicted for retrofit work.
Well, this sounds like it could result in lots of tenants being forced out of their homes. How do you think about, or maybe how do you square the sort of immediate crisis decarbonization potentially generates in the service of addressing the bigger existential climate crisis?
Yeah, well, I think it all comes down to the kind of approach the city decides to take with decarbonizing building, right? Like decarbonizing the building stock is going to be critically important to tackling climate change. And we can design the policy in a way that really centers tenants and, prohibits pass-through costs. That's something that New York City actually did in their local law 97. They basically prioritize the largest and highest emitting buildings first, so tackling a large amount of emission sources, and didn't allow any of the cost to be passed on to tenants. So that's something that's very possible and we can do here in LA.
Tell me a little bit more about that. What does the ideal path forward for LA look like? How can we ensure that people living in some of these older buildings just aren't going to be forced out because of modernization?
Yeah, so I think that the approach that the city should take is really following the footsteps of New York, is targeting those who can actually pay for decarbonization first and not allowing that cost to be absorbed by tenants. And, those, as I said, those who can pay for it first also happen to be the largest emitters. And almost 100% of those large buildings are owned by corporate landlords who have access to capital to be able to carry out decarbonization. They don't need financial support in the same way small landlords or affordable housing providers do. So when you start with this segment of property owners, you give policymakers more time and resources to craft a program for landlords who might actually be at risk of losing their properties if faced with the cost of decarbonization.
Last thing, is it a realistic goal to think that all of LA's buildings are going to reach zero emissions by 2050?
I'm hopeful we'll get there, but it's really going to depend on the approach the city takes. If the city is really serious and aggressive about it and puts those safeguards in place to protect tenants, I am hopeful that we'll see some change in the next 30 years.
Chelsea Kirk is a research and policy analyst at Strategic Actions for a Just Economy. Thanks for coming on, Chelsea.
Thank you so much, Matt.